This is Learning Science Unpacked, a podcast mini-series from Sponge, dedicated to unpacking the science behind how we learn and behave. Over the next few sessions, I'll be digging deep into the science of learning with Professor Paul Howard-Jones, an educational neuroscientist at Bristol University. Together, we'll uncover the most effective strategies workplace learning professionals can use to optimise learning for performance, something we do at Sponge every day. Hello, Paul.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good.
Good to see you back again.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us for this next episode in our series. And today we're going to be talking about neuromyths, which I hope you are happy to talk about because I think this is a bit of a passion area of yours. Am I right?
Yeah, yes.
Ish, yes.
In short.
Well, maybe you could just explain to us what a neuromyth is, and then we'll crack on and start chatting through a few.
Yeah, I mean, I think originally it was a term that was used by a surgeon in the 1970s, but it re-emerged when neuroscience and education started talking to each other because, it became very evident that there were already a lot of ideas floating around about the brain that clearly didn't have any scientific basis. And so the word neuromyth started being applied to any idea that involves the brain that doesn't actually have any scientific research behind it.
Okay, so what I've got for you today is a few claims, and I'd like you to help me understand whether these are in fact neuromyths or whether there's any truth to them. What I find particularly interesting about these claims is that usually there's a kind of grain of truth in there. So I'm kind of interested in unpacking that a little bit and just seeing why these things might stick in our consciousness.
Right.
So,
okay, hit me with it.
All right, I'm going to give you the first one. So, individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. Oh,
well, yeah, okay. So I'm glad you started off with this one because this is probably the one which is most widespread, and something like over 90% of teachers, not just in the UK but around the world, believe this to be true.
Wow.
Now, why is that? And I suppose it's because we feel we should be personalising learning, and we're looking for an easy way to do that. And this is the way with a lot of these myths. They really appeal to our biases and a desire to find a quick fix. And as you say, there's always a gleam of truth in these things. There's some sort of seed that started the whole thing off, some sort of scientific fact. And it is true that we have preferences in terms of how we learn, and those are reasonably stable. So I could ask you, whether you're a visual auditory learner and ask you a few questions, and you could indicate that, and you'd probably give me the same answer in a few months' time. So we could say, okay, you're a visual learner or whatever. But actually, the place where this falls down is that there's no evidence to suggest that you learn more efficiently if we deliver learning content in that style. In fact, there's even some evidence to suggest the opposite, which is quite interesting. I don't want to put too much weight on that because I think really we should just leave the whole thing behind. But yes, it's true that we have individual learning preferences. Yes, it's true that we should be catering for individual differences in learners. But there is no value in categorizing learners according to any of these very many learning styles that are based on self-report. So where you get a little survey and you tick the things and you find out you're a visual or auditory learner, or all the other ones, like whether you're more of a boy learner or a girl learner.
Really? That's a thing?
Yeah, that's a thing, yeah.
That's loaded, isn't it?
Yeah, and then once you've found... Yeah, I'm surprised it became popular.
Yeah.
But yeah, once you found out whether where you are on the scale, then you can sort of get learning materials that are catered for that type of learning style. But it's such a waste of time, and yet teachers do it so much. And I think it's very popular in universities as well. And I can see that it's popular in many training and development programs as well. It's very, very prevalent, this idea, and there's no psychological basis for it. The psychological experiments actually show, as I say, sometimes the opposite. The educational evidence is just not behind it. And in terms of the neuroscience, the brain's so interconnected anyway. If you just see a picture of a bell, your auditory cortex will activate. That's how interconnected the brain is. So, there's no neuroscience basis for it either. But quite often these learning styles are sold on the basis of neuroscience because people know they've got a visual cortex and auditory cortex. It kind of makes sense. It kind of feels, and this is a really common trait in all of these neuromyths. There's that common sense feel about them.
Yeah, it feels logical. It seems right. Yeah, I like maths. I'm not very, artistic, or I'm analytical, or whatever it might be. People have these perceptions of themselves. But what you're saying is it doesn't make any difference what your kind of preferences may be in terms of how you're taught. The way you're taught is not going to it's not affecting. Not
based on any of these self-report learning inventories anyway. Mm-hmm. I think it's another question entirely whether people, if you give people preferences in terms of how they want to learn, for example, so do you want this information as a video or do you want it as text? That's another question as to whether actually there's benefit in that at that particular moment. So that learner could be making that decision in that particular context.
So what's that about then? That's we're giving people the choice to pick out which method they would like to learn from, but how do we know that that's effective for them based on their choice?
Well, because it can vary according to the needs at the moment. So sometimes I take text into a meeting. Well, I'm not going to take a video,
Yeah.
So, and I mean, common sense again tells you that actually your personal preferences, you're being given the choice, if you like, can help with learning. Actually, we know that is to some extent the case, because having choice, having a sense of agency, increases your engagement. And when it increases your engagement, then you're more likely to learn.
Yeah.
So that alone is probably a justification for giving people options. But also, of course, people require flexibility, as I say, in terms of the different situations they're going to find themselves in. Today, I might have wanted that. Yesterday I might have wanted that information as text, but today actually I'd like it as a video. And we know that making links between different representations can be really helpful in terms of learning as well. So it's more likely to be the case that offering information in a variety of different forms is going to help all learners. That's the justification, I think, for using different modalities.
Okay, well, that's brilliant. I think that clears it up. There's no psychological, scientific, neuroscientific evidence for teaching to learning styles. We should push it all to one side and instead, but it is okay to think about different modalities, learner choice, and using methods, as we've talked about before, to engage and build knowledge.
Yeah, and specific to those particular contexts, but don't label learners.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, good. Myth 1, dispelled. Let's go to my second claim. I hear this a lot, actually. You still hear this. People with left or right brain dominance learn differently. What can we say about this one?
Well, I mean, one of the places this has come from is the fact that many people are aware that language is left lateralized. So we do have lateralization in the brain. So if you're right-handed, you're very likely to have your language or some important language centers in the left hemisphere. I mean, actually, if you're left-handed, there's like a 1 in 3 chance it'll be on the other side of the brain. So the lateralization exists in the brain, but doing anything, I mean, even, picking up a cup is going to actually activate left and right hemispheres. And in even those simple tasks, left and right hemispheres need to communicate with each other. And they do that through this thing called the Corpus Callosum, which connects the two hemispheres together. And it's like an information superhighway, and it allows the two hemispheres to operate in parallel in a sophisticated fashion, transferring information between two. So it doesn't really make sense even to say language is a left brain thing, because if you're making up a story, you'll definitely be using loads of centers on the right hand side of the brain, and you'll be visualizing, and that's going to be left and right parts of the brain. And So any simple task requires left and right hemispheres, and it just takes the confusion one step further when you start saying you're a left brain person, you're a right brain person. And as I said before, this is one of the methods that has sometimes been used to categorize people in terms of learning style, whether you're a left or a right brain learner. And there's no evidence to support that is helpful in terms of your learning.
And what about people who like to say that you're more creative or artistic if you're left-brained, or more analytical, whichever way that claim goes? Is there any? I know you've mentioned sort of writing, and is there anything around that, or can we just knock that on the head?
I mean, it is true as language is left lateralized. So there's most of the important centers for language are on the left hand side of the brain. There are some really important centers for creative thinking in the right hemisphere, but they can't operate in isolation. They're not going to do very much on their own. So again, you need left and right hemispheres to actually be creative. And I think a lot of this, when it boils down to, underneath this is this underlying sense that you're born in a particular way. And I think that's quite dangerous in a way, because it's very limiting. And one thing about creativity is that we know that we can increase your creativity. And this is actually an experiment that we did in our team a few years ago. And not only can you increase creativity by putting people in a particular context that demands them to be creative, asking them to make connections and links, but that will also increase activity in the right hemisphere. So are we saying that once you're in that context, you become a right brain person?
Yeah.
So let's sort of avoid this idea that the brain is some sort of biological limitation on what you can do. You build your brain to a large extent, and it's a potential. It's a capacity that's flexible. The brain is plastic. It means it changes with your learning.
Great. All right. Well, I think you've clarified for me that there are certain attributes to the left and right sides of our brain hemispheres, but that actually alone they won't do much. Everything's working together, and that in any case, it doesn't help to categorise learners, and there's no evidence to suggest that would even make a difference for better learning. And so instead, really, we should be focusing on activities that are going to, stimulate the whole brain, which we can't avoid anyway, because that's happening all the time. But thinking about the normal kinds of things that we would do for engagement and building knowledge and consolidation, and sort of steering it towards those EBCs that we've talked about in our previous first podcast episode.
I think so, yes. I mean, even amongst learners who actually have diagnosed disorders, like dyslexia and ADHD and such like, the basic processes that are taking place are still about engagement, building and consolidation of learning.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes you can understand these disorders in terms of those. So, for example, if you suffer from ADHD, one way of looking at that is that it's an underactivation of the reward system that actually prevents you from becoming engaged and absorbed in what's in front of you.
Interesting.
And the tactics for managing that disorder, when it comes to learning, things like short-term targets, increasing reward schedules, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
They're also things which work for other people, but maybe you need to give them a bit more emphasis if you're diagnosed with ADHD.
Okay. All right. I think I'm going to move on to our next claim. This is something I've heard about certain companies, I won't name who they are, making claims to enhance our cognitive ability through brain training games. And the claim is that these kinds of brain training games can improve memory, attention, problem solving. So the claim really here is, does brain training increase our IQ and sharpen our skills?
So this is a little bit more complex. I mean, there's actually some really interesting research that's going on in this area to suggest that it might be possible. And one way of increasing your flexible intelligence, for example, is to give you, and that's your ability to apply information and learning in new situations. One way to do that is to try to expand your working memory capacity using tasks that really place a great demand on your ability to hold information in your conscious attention. And they're not very comfortable to do. I mean, they're pretty hard work, not necessarily always fun, although they're better if they're put in a game context. So scientists are beginning to do this in the laboratory, and there is some really interesting results coming out. But as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, the ones that you can buy in the shops, the brain training games for your video console or whatever, have a lot of difficulty in transferring beyond the task. So generally what happens with these games is you get better at the task. And they don't transfer to everyday life. That's the sad news. I mean, there are some studies that show amongst, for example, learners who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they can be helpful. But your mainstream user on a commercial video brain training game should not expect that this is going to transfer to their everyday world. I mean, of course, if they're learning something specific like maths, then it will. But in terms of your general cognitive function, like your working memory, your executive function, that's not going to be expanded in a general way with these commercial brain training games. Sorry about that. It'd be nice if it was true, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but not a complete waste of time if you're doing a task that is one that means that you want to get better at that task. But in terms of kind of offering general improved IQ or this sort of generalised improved ability.
I mean, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention particular products.
Yeah, you can, because it helps give us some context. Go on.
Hey, well, I mean, Dr. Kawashima's brain training, for example, actually has a lot of maths in it. So there's a lot of mental maths. Great for your mental maths, because you're probably going to find it can add up a bit quicker after that. That's what you'd expect. But is your brain just going to get generally better in terms of its very general function? I'm not sure I'd expect that.
All right. Well, that's that one. That's that one mythed then, neuromythed. What about this one? This is an interesting one that we get in learning design quite often, and I'd be interested in your kind of take on this. So I'll give you a classic scenario. Learning designers putting together a course, and they include a question, sort of in the early part of the course that covers content that hasn't been taught yet in the course. So this is just a question that's kind of activating people's prior knowledge. And quite often there'll be some pushback on that because people haven't seen or been exposed to that content yet. And therefore, there's a nervousness that if people feel like they're being tested before they get this knowledge, they'll feel like it's unfair and they won't be able to answer the question. I think there's a lot of things wrapped up in this, but I suppose the key claim here would be that you can't activate this prior knowledge first, and it's got no relevance to learning new knowledge. And what would you say about that as an approach?
I think it always, rather than sort of saying an approach is good or bad, you want to go back to thinking about how learning happens, and that will guide you in all of these questions. So this is my mantra is, it's not about whether one strategy or another strategy is good or bad. It's going to depend. So if you really want to think about that strategy, think about the learning processes that are involved. Now, when we learn, new information comes into our working memory, but for it to be meaningful, we have to connect it to our prior knowledge. And that can happen automatically because the new information will increase the activation due to the old knowledge if it's linked to it already. So we get better at that. When we're children, we're quite bad at it. As we become more adult, we get better at being able to link with what we know already. But there are ways that you can scaffold that linking. And that's a really important thing for people who are trying to foster learning to do. And if you ask a question that is designed in a way to activate knowledge that is relevant not to what you're about to learn, then that's a really helpful way of doing it, because that knowledge, the representations of that knowledge in your brain, what you know already, are going to stay activated, and it makes it more likely that you're going to be able to link to it and understand the meaning of the information that's being presented. I mean, I suppose, for example, that first question could say, what are you going to do if blah 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 blah? And you think, well, I don't really know that yet. That's why I'm at this training course, you know.
Yep.
But it will have activated that context. And so you're going to be thinking about those things as people start explaining particular concepts. And you're going to be thinking, oh, yeah, that's relevant, that's meaningful. That's going to make it more likely that you're going to understand what you're learning, and also more likely that you're going to retain it as well.
Because you've thought about it for yourself.
Yeah, if you think about why you're asking those questions in terms of activating that prior knowledge, then those questions can be a really good thing to do. But if you ask a question which is so beyond anything that the learner understands or knows, clearly it's not going to do any good at all. But if it's a matter of getting a learner in that inquiring state where they're activating stuff which is going to be relevant, that's going to connect and help make the new concepts meaningful, that's good. Yeah.
There's a really lovely example of this by a learning designer kind of in our sort of circles that we admire, called Kathy Moore, and she advocates for kind of learning by doing. And one of the examples that she's made is called Learning Zico, and it's this made up language, but the idea is that you don't start kind of learning the language and then finally being placed into a scenario. The whole kind of course starts as a sort of branch narrative where you're thrown right into this. So you've just landed, I think you're a journalist or something, you're on a mission to get somewhere to cover a story, and you're thrown into this kind of taxi and you don't speak this language at all, and someone's kind of asking for you to tell them which direction you want to go in, and you don't speak the language, and it kind of it's really you have no prior knowledge of that language at all. Obviously you do have prior knowledge of being in a taxi probably and kind of getting to somewhere, but you figure it out. What would you say about that kind of an experience? Is that good? It feels like a good way of learning.
Yeah, I mean, it can be. A small amount of that can be quite helpful because, I mean, as you say, you're aware of the taxi, so you know about the sorts of things that you might get asked in a taxi, and immediately you're starting to listen to the person who are coming out with these utterances, and you're thinking about the context, and it's getting you into that mind state of trying to understand the link between what somebody's saying and the context. And for understanding, it sounds to me like the way that this is going to be taught, that's a really important mind state to be in. So, and therefore you're making contact with all that knowledge about how what are common words that are spoken. You're going to be activating those words, like you're going to be looking out now for hello, where, maybe
left, right,
word, left, right. Suddenly all those are going to start getting activated, and that's how you begin to start making sense.
Good. All right. Well, I think that's actually really useful and a real practical one for us to know that we can use these approaches, but key is to think about how learning happens and to make sure that we're choosing
why you're doing
this
it.
Context.
Yeah.
I like this, activating the context. I think that's a helpful phrase. Okay, what else have we got here? Oh, this takes me back to like teenage years. How about this? It's very kind of like, oh yeah, of course this is true, like wisdom from when I was younger. You only remember 10% of what you read, but 90% of what you do. But I think actually where this comes from is that, again, in sort of e-learning circles and learning circles, there's what's called Dale's cone of experience, which I'm not sure if you've seen this cone of experience, but it sort of makes these compelling, if completely unscientific, claims that we remember very little of what we read, but we remember most of what we do. And I think it's been shown that the science for this is just not true. But from a neuroscientific point of view, can we apportion 10% of things to what we read and 90%? Is it that simple?
So, I mean, there is a small amount of research on this. If you think about it in terms of very much a laboratory setting where you're, 10 words are spoken to you, and then you're asked to write down, 10 words, or you're asked to speak 10 words. Actually, you can listen very passively without hardly processing the information that's coming through. If you're speaking, you have to put a little bit more effort into it. So if you're reading out aloud, for example, and then if you're writing, you're actually activating more of the brain, and you're having to make connections between the meaning of the word, the sound of the word, the visual representation of the word, and actually the motor movements required to produce that visual representation. And as a result of that, you're going to be making links between those different representations. And this goes back to this idea that, that's a really important way to learn, because you have multiple representations in your head. They're easier to access. One activates the other one. If one activates, you're more likely to remember the whole thing. And so there's some basis for it. But it's just too simple, and it just keeps going back to what I'm saying about avoiding prescriptions, and really thinking about the processes. So, if you're going to ask people to read and to write, and you're going to look at things, ask yourself about how they're going to be making those connections. Think about why you're doing it. Don't just say, okay, well, it's better for everybody to just write stuff now. You need multiple representations, and you need people to be looking for the links between them, and drawing on the links between them.
Tell me a bit about the enactment effect.
Yeah, so that comes down to the writing. I was mentioning that, as well as thinking about the visual, you're actually having to move your hand. And the enactment effect, in essence, is that if you do something, it increases your ability to retain the information. And that, well, there's two things about this. First of all, as I've said, you're having to link two different types of representation. That's really important. But it's worth bearing in mind that ever since we were jellyfish, our neurons have a basic design principle of our nervous system, our brain. Jellyfish don't actually have a brain, but they do have neurons. And they were the first creature to get neurons in the evolutionary story. And it's about processing incoming sensory information and turning it into action. That's a general organizing principle of the brain, and it always has been. It's fundamental to how our brain is organized. So, we were not designed to sit in design. We weren't designed at all. We did not evolve to be in training rooms, sitting quietly, listening to information. Actually, learning and memory, it's almost like, if you like, it's a byproduct of action. So the idea it's going to occur without any action is a bit odd. We have managed to do it because it's so efficient in a way. If you just get 100 people and tell them information, they can just about do it. But they can sit in the same room. It's a very efficient way of communicating, but in some senses. But to expect them to retain and understand that information, that requires a lot more mental effort, because that's not how we evolved. That's not what we evolved to do, really.
Okay. All right. So mix up your activities. In terms of what we can remember, it's about kind of relevance and interest and making connections and links. And I think that we can be confident that actually there's no scientific basis to this claim. It's a bit of a myth, whether it's a neuromyth or not, it's a myth. And that there is some evidence to suggest that you can do activities more passively and some more actively, but actually mixing them up, that's okay as a kind of strategy when we're thinking about learning designs.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Well, you know what? We have one more claim left, and this one gets a bit more out there.
Are aliens involved?
This is actually,
I love aliens.
Sadly, well, we might be able to weave this. Okay, hit points for you if you can weave aliens into this one. This is about listening to binaural music. I'm sure you've seen the kind of popularity of kind of YouTube, full of these music channels. I can see the mind whirring. What can you tell us? Does listening to binaural music, the claims that they make are that it can improve learning, it can improve concentration. I've even seen this on a website. Studies have shown that the calming effect of binaural beats have on the brain boosts positivity. Users consistently report feelings of increased optimism, contentment, and happiness. Binaural beats are capable of eliminating stress and pressure from the mind, making us more focused and attentive. I mean, what? Give me some. Is there any truth to this?
I mean, the research that I've seen on this, it is quite interesting. So when you're wearing a device that's giving you binaural beats, and the one that I've used also actually uses flashing lights as well. So it does actually feel like an alien disco.
Brilliant. You did it.
It does entrain your brain rhythms. So your brain rhythms will change, and people do report that they feel more relaxed. And what I found odd about it was that I didn't want to take it off. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Why was that, do you think?
I don't know, but I mean, I suppose, I don't know. But it was quite nice. I mean, but sadly, the research doesn't tend to indicate that it increases your ability to learn, or that there's no, apart from possible relaxing effect, which can be helpful if you feel anxious about learning, I guess. There's no evidence that it can improve your ability to learn, and then there are no effects that last after you've taken it off that would support your learning, basically.
Okay.
And the brain rhythm changes tend to occur whilst you're wearing it. But interesting, and I wouldn't stop anybody from using it in order to chill out and relax. I think that's great, and I find it fascinating that your brain rhythms do actually change. But again, it's a little bit like the learning styles thing, insofar as it's something we quite enjoy doing, but are there any actual effects on learning? Can't really find any. So sadly, it would be wonderful if it did, but it's not the quick fix that we would love it to be.
We all hope for. Well, brilliant. I think that about covers our neuromyths for today, and we've covered some interesting ones, and I think you've just helped us think about not getting kind of drawn into some of the prevailing kind of quite compelling, sometimes quite persuasive, quite kind of logical arguments, and actually to have the confidence to question them, challenge them, think about what's really going on, and perhaps re-steer our focus towards strategies that we know that work, thinking about representations, thinking about making links, asking ourselves questions about why we're putting in certain interactions and how that might support learning, rather than perhaps taking what we think might be right and just kind of passively using it. So I think that you've definitely improved my confidence in kind of challenging these things. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
And we will be back next time. And I really appreciate your time, Paul. Thanks so much. Always great to see you.
No worries. Nice to talk. Bye-bye.